The auditorium of North Ridge University vibrated with a low, expectant hum, a sound woven from the rustle of programs, the soft clicks of cameras, and the proud, murmured conversations of families. It was a symphony of culmination, of achievement. I sat in the designated front row seat, a solitary island in a sea of beaming couples and boisterous family clans. My hands, resting in the lap of my old blue dress, were cold and still, clutching a small hand-tied bouquet of lavender and Queen Anne's lace. Ethan, my son, had always despised this dress, once remarking with the casual cruelty of a teenager that it made me look like a librarian from a forgotten era. He was not wrong. It was a garment of quiet utility, of steadfastness. It was the only thing in my life that felt entirely my own, a shield of familiar fabric against a world that had grown increasingly foreign. My heart, a frantic bird against my ribs, pounded in time with the processional march. And then I saw him. Ethan. He moved across the stage, a confident stride in his flowing black gown, the golden tassel of his mortarboard swinging like a pendulum, marking the seconds until my world would break. He was tall, handsome, the very picture of the success I had spent a lifetime cultivating in the shadows. For one perfect, crystalline moment, a wave of pure, unadulterated pride washed over me. So potent, it threatened to bring me to my feet in applause. This was it. This was the culmination of every grueling shift at the woolen mill, every cheap meal of beans and bread, every night spent hunched over account ledgers, turning pennies into possibilities. He reached the podium, adjusted the microphone, and smiled out at the crowd, a practiced, polished smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Then he began to speak, and every word was a precision-cut shard of glass aimed directly at me. "You never hugged me at graduation," he began, his voice resonant and clear, imbued with a performer's command of pathos. The accusation, a deliberate lie, landed with stunning force. I was instantly transported back a decade to a smaller, less grand auditorium. A younger Ethan, his face flushed with the awkward pride of a middle school graduate stepping off the stage. I had started to rise then, my arms already open to enfold him, but Miranda, his impeccably dressed stepmother, had placed a manicured hand on my arm. "Not now, Elara," she'd murmured, her voice a silken blade. "Let's not cause a scene." I had sunk back into my seat, my open arms falling to my sides, the image of his retreating back seared into my mind. Now he was wielding that private, engineered moment of shame as a public truth. "You were never proud," he continued, his gaze sweeping over the audience before finally, deliberately, landing on me. "To me," he paused, letting the silence stretch, amplifying the blow that was to come. "You were never a real mother." The hum of the auditorium died. A vacuum of shocked silence descended, so absolute I could hear the frantic beat of my own blood in my ears. A woman in pearls beside me turned to her husband, her mouth a perfect O of surprise. My throat constricted, and a hot, acidic burn crept up into my eyes. An instinct, older than reason, compelled me to rise, to call out his name, to correct this monstrous fiction. But as I shifted, his eyes locked with mine. There was no flicker of doubt, no hint of sorrow. There was only a cold, hard warning, a silent command that pushed me back down into my seat, into the role of the silent, shamed matriarch he was creating. My knees trembled. The delicate wildflowers in my lap seemed to wilt from the poison in the air. His voice gained momentum, feeding on the drama. "All those years you claim you supported me," he boomed, his tone shifting to one of righteous grievance. "You never gave me what I truly wanted. You were always second-rate, always an embarrassment." He gestured vaguely toward me, an accuser on a stage. Then came the masterstroke, the lie so audacious it was almost brilliant. She spent my college money on strangers. She always cared more about her charity cases than her own son. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the rows. This was a narrative people could understand: the martyred son, the negligent mother. Head swiveled in my direction, eyes wide with a morbid curiosity that felt like a physical violation. I felt my cheeks flush with a heat that had nothing to do with the stage lights. My body began to tremble, a deep cellular tremor of shock and profound heartbreak. But then, something else surfaced from the depths. Beneath the pain, a bedrock of cold, unshakable resolve began to form. My shaking stilled. My breathing steadied. My spine straightened. I reached into my small, worn leather purse, my fingers bypassing my handkerchief to touch the crisp edge of a sealed envelope. It was not the will, not the final, damning document. That was miles away, locked in the climate-controlled vault of Thorne Associates, far from the heat of this moment. This was just a summary letter from my lawyer, Beatrice Thorne, a single page that outlined the cold, hard legal reality I had constructed. It was my secret armor. As his speech reached its crescendo, I held the letter, not as a threat, but as a promise to myself. He thought this stage was his weapon, a platform to broadcast his version of the truth. He was about to learn that while words fade, a notarized signature is eternal. The son who had just declared I was never a real mother would soon discover in the stark, unforgiving language of the law that I had already agreed with him. I had stopped being his mother legally, and his inheritance had vanished with the title. My life of sacrifice was not an abstract concept. It was a tapestry woven from the threads of exhaustion, pain, and a fierce, stubborn love. My memories were not hazy emotions. They were visceral, sensory experiences. I remembered the woolen mill in Serenity Peaks, a cavernous building that smelled of damp fleece, machine oil, and human sweat. For 20 years I had stood at a loom, the deafening rhythmic clatter a constant soundtrack to my days. I remembered the fibers working their way into the cracks of my skin, my fingers often raw and blistered by nightfall. I would stand for 10 hours, my mind a blur, but my focus was always sharp on a single image. Ethan, in a cap and gown, standing on a stage just like this one, his future a bright, shining thing I was weaving from my own fatigue. The money from that work, carefully saved in a coffee tin under my bed, became his textbooks, his field trip fees, his first real winter coat. I remembered the quiet shame of our kitchen table. When Ethan was 10, his world was expanding, and he began to see our life through the eyes of his wealthier friends. I would cook hearty meals of beans, lentils, and fresh-baked bread, but he would stare at his plate with a silent resentment. One evening, after a friend had visited, I overheard him on the phone. "She made me eat beans again," he'd whispered, his voice thick with a child's humiliation. "Brad had steak." The words were a small, sharp knife in my heart. I said nothing, but the next week I took on an extra mending job for a local seamstress, working late into the night, my eyes burning, just so I could afford a small steak for his birthday. He ate it without comment. Every autumn, I baked caramel apple pies. It was my one small, joyful ritual. The apples came from a gnarled tree in our backyard, a tree he had helped me plant as a small boy. I remembered the sticky sweetness of the caramel, the warm cloud of cinnamon that filled our small house, a scent I equated with love. When he was 14, he took one bite of a pie I had just pulled from the oven and made a face of theatrical disgust. "Mother, honestly," he'd said, his voice dripping with the new, sophisticated disdain he'd adopted, "this smells like a trailer park." His stepmother, Miranda, who had been visiting, had laughed a little too loudly. I had simply nodded, the smile on my face feeling like a fragile mask, and silently wrapped the rest of the pie for the church bake sale. I remembered the photograph. It was a simple, candid shot of him at 5, cheeks rosy from the cold, wearing a mismatched coat and a triumphant grin as he held up a wiggling earthworm. I had framed it and hung it in our hallway. It was, to me, a perfect distillation of his boyhood joy. And when he was in high school, preparing to bring a date home for the first time, he saw it. "For God's sake, can you get rid of your wallpaper emotions?" He'd snapped, and before I could react, he'd yanked it from the wall. The frame clattered to the floor, the glass cracking into a spiderweb over his smiling face. He had stormed off, leaving me to sweep up the pieces, and I remembered the snowstorm. He was 16, and a raging pneumonia had settled in his lungs. A blizzard had shut down the town, but his fever was dangerously high. I wrapped him in every blanket we owned and half-carried him the 2 miles to the emergency room, the wind a physical force against us, the snow blinding. I remembered the terrifying rattle in his chest, my whispered prayers, a desperate mantra against the storm. Years later, he would recast this memory of my desperate, fierce love into another one of his embarrassments. "You were a mess," he told me. Crying and carrying on in front of the nurses. It was humiliating. Through all of it, every cut, every dismissal, I kept saving. I was a phantom investor. The woman in the worn coat and sensible shoes was quietly meeting with a financial advisor in the next town over. I was buying small shares of stock, creating trust accounts, building a fortress of financial independence that Ethan never saw. He saw the beans on the table, not the burgeoning portfolio. He saw the patched coat, not the growing foundation accounts. He saw a poor, simple woman, and that was exactly what I had allowed him to see. It was safer that way. The decision to finally act was not born in an instant, but had been growing for years, a seed of resolve watered by 1,000 small cruelties. The meeting with Beatrice Thorne was the turning point. Her office was an oasis of calm and order, smelling of old leather and rain-spattered windows. "He's going to paint you as a bitter, vindictive woman, Alara," Beatrice had warned, her sharp, intelligent eyes searching mine. "He will say you are unstable, that you are doing this out of spite. You have to be prepared for that." I had looked down at my worn hands, the hands that had worked the looms and kneaded the bread. "This isn't about vengeance, Beatrice," I'd said, my voice quiet but firm. "This is about truth. He has built his entire identity on a foundation of lies, lies about me, lies about our past. He has the right to his feelings, but he does not have the right to his own facts. My life, my work, my love, it was real. This is simply a correction of the record, written in a language he will be forced to understand." From that day on, I began to assemble my archive. It was a painful, meticulous process. I spent nights at my kitchen table, surrounded by boxes of paper, organizing a lifetime of receipts and letters into a coherent narrative of my sacrifice. Each document was a ghost. The hospital invoice for Ethan's pneumonia, stamped with a payment plan I had barely managed to meet. The tuition receipts from the private high school Miranda had insisted upon, all paid from my investment accounts. The crumpled, tear-stained letter from his 8-year-old self. I placed each one in a protective sleeve, labeling it with a date and context. It felt like I was curating a museum exhibit of my own unacknowledged life. When the new will was finally drafted, the signing was a somber, almost funereal occasion. Beatrice, a notary, and 2 of her paralegals as witnesses. As I signed my name on the line, I felt a profound, gut-wrenching sorrow. I was legally severing myself from my only child. But I was also giving birth to something new, a foundation that would honor the quiet, unseen work of mothers everywhere, and a future where my own truth could no longer be erased. I walked out of that office not as a mother scorned, but as the architect of my own justice. The digital storm broke less than 24 hours after the graduation ceremony. It began not with a thunderclap, but with a single, quiet post. Marcus, one of Ethan's old high school friends and a boy I had always known to have a good heart, had been troubled by the speech. He sent me a short, hesitant message. "Alara, I'm so sorry about what he said. But did you really spend his college fund?" This was the first test. I took a deep breath and responded not with emotion, but with facts. I sent him a redacted copy of the university's financial statement showing the tuition had been paid in full from a trust account in my name. I sent him a summary of the Hearthstone Foundation's initial charter, showing it was funded by my own separate investments. I asked for nothing. I simply presented the truth. An hour later, Marcus posted a screenshot of our exchange with a simple caption. "There are 2 sides to every story, and sometimes one side has receipts." That was the spark. The story was picked up by a local blogger, and from there, it exploded. The court of public opinion convened with a ferocity that stunned me. At first, the narrative was chaotic. Friends of Ethan and Miranda rushed to his defense, painting me as a cold, manipulative woman who had always resented her son's success. They called my carefully saved evidence an obsession, a sign of my instability. She was always a martyr, one of Miranda's friends wrote. She wanted him to feel guilty for having more than she did. But then, my silent army began to speak. The first was Mrs. Petrova's daughter, now a nurse at the county hospital. She wrote a long, emotional post detailing her mother's battle with a rare form of cancer. She wrote about how, when their insurance ran out, a secret benefactor had paid for the experimental treatment that saved her mother's life. She had never known who it was, until now. She posted a photo of the clinic's donation ledger, showing a series of anonymous contributions that matched the exact amounts from my foundation's records. Elara Sterling didn't just give money, she wrote. She gave me my mother back. Her story opened the floodgates. A former teacher wrote about how I had quietly paid for winter coats for 3 children in Ethan's class, whose families were struggling. The owner of the local diner posted about the countless times I had paid the tab for a family that looked like they were down on their luck. A young woman, now a successful lawyer in Chicago, wrote that I had been the one to encourage her to apply for a scholarship, driving her to the interview myself because her family's car had broken down. The narrative began to shift from a he said, she said family drama to something larger. The story of a woman whose quiet, consistent acts of kindness formed an invisible network of support throughout the entire community. A local journalist, a young woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, reached out for an interview. I was hesitant, but Beatrice advised me to do it. "Let them see you, Elara," she said. "Let them see your strength." I sat in my simple living room, my blue dress on, and told my story. I did not rail against my son. I simply stated the facts of my life, my hands occasionally gesturing to the stacks of evidence I had neatly organized on my coffee table. The resulting article, titled "The House That Beans and Bread Built," went viral. Meanwhile, Ethan's attempts to control the narrative were backfiring spectacularly. He gave an interview to a sympathetic talk show host where he doubled down on his story of a deprived childhood and an emotionally distant mother. But the host, armed with the now public evidence, pressed him. "But Ethan," she asked, "if the tuition was paid, what exactly did you feel you were deprived of?" He faltered, speaking vaguely of emotional support, of wanting a mother who was more prestigious. The public saw it for what it was, the hollow complaint of a privileged man who was ashamed of his own humble origins. Watching this all unfold from my small house, I felt a strange mix of terror and vindication. For decades my life had been a secret. Now it was being debated, dissected, and judged by thousands of strangers. It was terrifying. But for the first time, people were seeing me, the real me, and they were believing me. One evening, Lila, my granddaughter, was scrolling through the comments on the journalist's article. She looked up at me, her eyes wide. "Grandma," she whispered, "they see you now." In that moment, I knew that whatever happened in the courtroom, I had already won the battle that mattered most. The courtroom was a sterile, intimidating space, all polished wood and hushed tones. But as I walked in, flanked by Beatrice, and trailed by a small contingent of supporters from the town, I did not feel afraid. I felt a profound sense of calm. I was not here to plead for sympathy. I was here to present the facts. Ethan's legal team came out swinging, their strategy immediately clear: to portray me as mentally incompetent, a woman driven mad by grief and resentment. His lead counsel, a man with a slick, condescending smile, painted a picture of me as an obsessive hoarder of receipts and grievances, a woman whose grasp on reality had slipped. He formally petitioned the court to order a psychological evaluation. But Beatrice was ready. She dismantled their argument not with impassioned speeches, but with a methodical, relentless presentation of evidence. One by one, our witnesses took the stand. Marcus testified about my clear-headed, factual response to his initial query. Mrs. Petrova, looking frail but speaking in a clear, strong voice, detailed my careful management of her treatment fund. My financial advisor presented a decade's worth of statements showing a pattern of shrewd, consistent, and entirely rational investment decisions. The turning point came when Beatrice submitted a piece of evidence she had been holding in reserve, a secretly recorded video from a family dinner 2 years prior, taken by Lila on her phone. In the clip, Ethan, unaware he was being recorded, was complaining to Miranda about an upcoming visit from me. "I just hate having to pretend." His voice dripped with disdain. "I have to carry the weight of her sad little life everywhere I go. I just wish she would fade away quietly." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. The judge's face was a mask of stern disapproval. Ethan blanched, staring at his daughter as if seeing her for the first time. Then Lila was called to the stand. She was small, her feet barely touching the floor, but her voice was steady. Beatrice asked her to describe her relationship with me. "She's my best friend," Lila said simply. "She teaches me how to bake, and she reads me stories. She taught me that being strong doesn't mean being loud." Then Beatrice asked her to identify the faded Polaroid of me and Ethan in the kitchen. "That's my dad," she said, her voice dropping, "before he forgot how to be happy." Ethan's lawyer, attempting to recover, made a fatal mistake. He approached Lila for cross-examination. "Your grandmother has been telling you a lot of stories lately, hasn't she?" he asked in a syrupy sweet tone. Lila looked him directly in the eye. "My grandma doesn't tell stories," she said, her voice ringing with a child's irrefutable logic. "She has receipts." The courtroom erupted in soft laughter, and the judge banged his gavel, but a small smile played on his lips. After that, the proceedings were a formality. Beatrice presented the flawlessly executed will. The defense had nothing left. Finally, the judge cleared his throat and delivered his ruling. After reviewing the extensive and frankly overwhelming evidence presented, he began, his gaze sweeping from me to Ethan. "This court finds Ilara Sterling to be of sound mind and full legal capacity. Her petition to sever the legal rights and responsibilities of motherhood is granted. Consequently, the amended will is found to be valid and enforceable. All inheritance rights of the beneficiary, Ethan Sterling, are hereby forfeited. The entirety of the estate shall be transferred as stipulated to the Hearthstone Foundation." The gavel fell with a crack that echoed the breaking of my world all those months ago. But this sound was not one of destruction. It was one of finality, of order restored. Ethan's jaw hung open, his face a mask of disbelief. He had been so certain of his power, of his narrative. He had never imagined that my quiet, invisible life had its own power, a power that had just unmade him. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding for 30 years. I was no longer defined by him. I was defined by the truth. The aftermath of the verdict was a slow, quiet unraveling for Ethan. His coerced, court-mandated public apology was a stilted, soulless affair that convinced no one. His name, once a synonym for bright young success, became a cautionary tale about arrogance and cruelty. His business partners dissolved their agreements, his brand endorsements vanished, and he was quietly asked to step down from the board of a prominent local charity. His world, built on the fragile scaffolding of image, collapsed under the weight of proven fact. My world, in contrast, began to bloom. The Hearthstone Foundation flourished, fueled by the full weight of my estate and a flood of donations from strangers who had been moved by my story. We opened a new library wing in Serenity Peaks and launched a mentorship program for first-generation college students. My life was no longer small or silent. It was filled with the sounds of children reading, of grateful conversations, of a community being knitted back together. They asked me to speak at the high school graduation the following spring. I stood on a stage, much like the one that had been the site of my greatest humiliation, and looked out at a sea of young, hopeful faces. I wore my blue dress. For most of my life, I told them, I believed that a mother's love should be silent and unconditional. I have learned that love must also be truthful. Do not let anyone else's shame silence your truth. Your story, your work, your life. It is real. Do not ever let anyone convince you otherwise. That evening, we held a small dedication ceremony for a new community garden funded by the foundation. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the freshly tilled earth, Lila and I planted a small apple sapling in the center plot. She patted the soil around its base, her small hands mirroring the motions I had taught her. "Grandma," she said, looking up at me, her face glowing in the twilight, "you are more than real to me. You're the one who taught us all how to grow things." I looked at the garden, at the faces of the families tending their plots, at the library glowing in the distance. My inheritance was not in stocks or bank accounts. It was here. It was in the seeds we were planting, in the stories we were sharing, in the quiet, resilient strength of a community that had learned to value the unseen. He had said I was not a real mother. But in the end, by law, by proof, and by a love that had finally learned to speak its own name, I had become the mother of so much more.